Hello, my lovelies, and welcome back to Bedtime Stories with Celosia Crane and the second half of this story, Prince Ahmed and the Fairy. So without further ado, we're just going to jump right into this one, and we are going to finish out this wonderful fairy tale from the Arabian Nights. Though the Sultan of the Indies was very sure that Prince Ahmed's natural disposition was good, yet he could not help being uneasy at the remarks of the old sorceress, and said, "I thank you for the pains you have taken in your wholesome caution. I am so aware of the great importance it is to me that I shall take advice upon it." He had been consulting with his favorites when he was told of the magician's arrival. He ordered her to follow him to them. He acquainted them with what he had learned, and communicated to them also the reason he had to fear the fairy's influence over the prince, and asked them what measures they thought most proper to prevent so great a misfortune. One of the favorites, taking upon himself to speak for the rest, said, "Your Majesty knows who must be the author of this mischief. In order to prevent it, now that he is in your court and in your power, you ought not to hesitate to put him under arrest. I will not say take away his life, for that would make too much noise, but make him a close prisoner while he lives." This advice all the other favorites unanimously applauded. The magician, who thought it too violent, asked the Sultan leave to speak, which being granted, she said, "Sir, I am persuaded that the zeal of your counselors for your Majesty's interest makes them propose arresting Prince Ahmed. But they will not take it amiss if I suggest to your and their consideration that if you arrest the prince, you must also detain his retinue. But they are all genies. Do they think it will be so easy to surprise, seize, and secure their persons? Will they not disappear, by the property they possess of rendering themselves invisible, and transport themselves instantly to the fairy, and give her an account of the insult offered to her husband? And can it be supposed she will let it go unrevenged? But it would be better if by any other means which might not make so great a noise, the Sultan could secure himself against any ill designs Prince Ahmed may have against him, and not involve his Majesty's honor. If his Majesty has any confidence in my advice, as genies and fairies can do things impractical to men, he will touch Prince Ahmed's honor, and engage him, by means of the fairy, to procure certain advantages. For example, every time your Majesty takes the field, you are obliged to go to a great expense, not only in pavilions and tents for yourself and army, but likewise in mules and camels and other beasts of burden, to carry their luggage. Might you not request him to use his interest with the fairy to procure you a tent, which might be carried in a man's hand, and which should be large enough to shelter your whole army? I need say no more to your Majesty. If the prince brings such a tent, you may make a great many other demands of the same nature, so that at last he may sink under the difficulties and the impossibility of executing them, however fertile the invention the fairy who has enticed him from you by her enchantments may be, so that in time he will be ashamed to appear, and will be forced to pass the rest of his life with his fairy, excluded from any connection with this world. And then your Majesty will have nothing to fear, and cannot be reproached with so detestable an action as the shedding of a son's blood, or confining him to prison for life." When the magician had finished her speech, the Sultan asked his favorites if they had anything better to propose, and finding them all silent, determined to follow the magician's advice, as the most reasonable and the most suited to his mild manner of government. The next day, When the prince came into his father's presence and had sat down by him, after a conversation on different subjects, the Sultan said, "Son, when you came and dispelled those clouds of melancholy which your long absence had brought upon me, you made the place you had chosen for your retreat a mystery to me. I was satisfied with seeing you again, and knowing that you were content with your condition, without wishing to penetrate into your secret, which I found you did not care I should. I know not what reason you had thus to treat a father. I know your good fortune. I rejoice with you, and very much approve of your conduct in marrying a fairy so worthy of your love, and so rich and powerful, as I am informed. Powerful as I am, it was not possible for me to have procured so great a match for you. Now that you are raised to so high a rank as to be envied by everybody but a father like me, I not only desire you to preserve the good understanding we have lived in hitherto, but to use all your credit with your fairy to obtain for me her assistance when I want it. I therefore will make a trial this day. I am persuaded you could easily procure from her a pavilion that might be carried in a man's hand, yet which would extend over my whole army, especially when you let her know it is for me. Though it may be a difficult thing, she will not refuse you. All the worlds know that fairies are capable of doing the most extraordinary things." Prince Ahmed never expected that the Sultan his father would have asked a thing which at first sight appeared to him so difficult, not to say impossible. Though he knew not absolutely how great the power of genies and fairies was, he doubted whether it extended so far as to furnish a tent such as his father desired. Moreover, he had never asked anything like it of the fairy Pari Banu, but was satisfied with her continual kindness. Therefore, he was in the greatest embarrassment what answer to make. At last he replied, "If, sir, I have concealed from your majesty what happened to me and what course I took after finding my arrow, the reason was that I thought it was of no great importance to you to be informed of them. And though I know not how this mystery has been revealed to you, I cannot deny that your information is correct. I have married the fairy you speak of. I love her, and am persuaded she loves me. But I can say nothing as to the influence your majesty believes I have over her. It is what I have not yet made any experiment of, or thought of, and should be very glad if you would dispense with my undertaking it, and let me enjoy the happiness of loving and being loved with all the disinterestedness I propose to myself. But the demand of a father is a command upon every child, who, like me, thinks it is his duty to obey him in everything. And though it is with the greatest reluctance imaginable, I will not fail to ask my wife the favor your majesty desires, but will not promise to obtain it. And if I should not have the honor to come again to pay you my respects, that shall be the sign that I have not had success. But I desire you to forgive me beforehand, and consider that you yourself have reduced me to this extremity." "Son," replied the Sultan of the Indies, "I should be very sorry that what I ask of you should prevent my ever seeing you again. Go, only ask her. Think with yourself that as you love her, you could refuse her nothing. Therefore, if she loves you, she will not deny your request." All this discourse of the Sultan of the Indies could not persuade Prince Ahmed, who would rather he had asked anything than the risk of displeasing his dear Pari Banu, and so great was his vexation that he left the court 2 days sooner than usual. When he returned, the fairy, to whom he had always before appeared with a cheerful countenance, asked him the reason of the alteration, and finding that instead of answering her, he inquired after her health to avoid satisfying her, she said to him, "I will answer your question when you have answered mine." The prince declined it a long time, protesting that nothing was the matter with him, But the more he denied it, the more she pressed him, and said, "I cannot bear to see you in this condition. Tell me what makes you so uneasy, that I may remove the cause of it, whatever it may be, for it must be very extraordinary if it is out of my power." Prince Ahmed could not long withstand the fairy. "Madam," said he, "God prolong the Sultan my father's life, and bless him to the end of his days. I left him alive and in perfect health. Therefore that is not the cause of the melancholy you perceive in me. The Sultan has imposed upon me the disagreeable task of worrying you. You know the care I have taken, with your approbation, to conceal from him my happiness at home with you. How he has been informed of it I cannot tell." Here the fairy Pari Banu interrupted Prince Ahmed and said, "But I know. Remember what I told you of the woman who made you believe she was ill, on whom you took so much compassion. It is she who has acquainted the Sultan your father with what you took so much care to hide from him. I told you that she was no more sick than you or I. For, after the 2 women whom I charged to take care of her had given her the water sovereign against all fevers, which, however, she had no occasion for, she pretended that the water had cured her, and was brought to take leave of me, that she might go sooner to give an account of the success of her undertaking. She was in so much haste that she would have gone away without seeing my palace, if I had not, by bidding my 2 women show it to her, given her to understand that it was worth her seeing. But go on, and tell me what is the necessity your father has imposed on you, which has made you feel troublesome to me, which I desire you will be persuaded you can never be." "Madam," pursued Prince Ahmed, "you may have observed that hitherto I have never asked you any favor, for what, after the possession of so kind a wife, can I desire more? I know how great your power is, but I have taken care not to make trial of it. Consider then, I beg you, that it is not me, but the Sultan my father, who indiscreetly, as I think, asks of you a pavilion large enough to shelter him, his court, and his army from the violence of the weather when he takes the field, and yet small enough for a man to carry in his hand. Once more remember, it is not I, but the Sultan my father who asks this favor." "Prince," replied the fairy, smiling, "I am sorry that so small a matter should disturb you and make you so uneasy. I see plainly 2 things have contributed toward it. One is, the law you have imposed upon yourself, to be content with loving me and being loved by me, and to deny yourself the liberty of asking me the least favor that might try my power. The other, I do not doubt, whatever you may say, was that you thought what your father asked of me was out of my power. As to the first, I commend you for it, and shall love you the better, if possible. And for the second, I must tell you that what the Sultan your father asks of me is a trifle, and upon occasion I can do much more difficult things. Therefore, be easy, and persuaded that, far from feeling worried, I shall always take great pleasure in whatever you can desire me to do for your sake." Then the fairy sent for her treasurer, to whom she said, "Nourgahan," which was her name, "bring me the largest pavilion in my treasury." Nourgahan returned presently with a pavilion, which could not only be held, but concealed in the palm of the hand when it was closed, and presented it to her mistress, who gave it to Prince Ahmed to look at. When the prince saw the pavilion, which the fairy called the largest in her treasury, he fancied she was joking, and his surprise appeared in his face. Pari Banu burst out laughing. "What, prince?" she cried. "Do you think I jest with you? You will see presently that I am in earnest. Nourgahan," she said to her treasurer, taking the tent out of Prince Ahmed's hands, "go and set it up, that the prince may judge whether the Sultan, his father, will think it large enough." The treasurer immediately went out from the palace and carried it to such a distance that when she had set it up one end reached to the palace. The prince, so far from thinking it small, found it large enough to shelter 2 armies as numerous as that of the Sultan his father, and then said to Pari Banu, "I ask my princess 1,000 pardons for my incredulity. After what I have seen, I believe there is nothing impossible to you." "You see," said the fairy, "that the pavilion is larger than your father may have occasion for, but you are to observe that it becomes larger or smaller according to the army it is to cover, without being touched." The treasurer took down the tent again, reduced it to its first size, and brought it and put it into the prince's hands. He took it, and next day mounted his horse and went with the usual attendants to the Sultan his father. The Sultan, who was persuaded that such a tent as he asked for was beyond all possibility, was in great surprise at the prince's diligence. He took the tent and admired its smallness, but when he had set it up in the great plain and found it large enough to shelter an army twice as large as he could bring into the field, his amazement was so great that he could not recover from it. As he thought this might be troublesome in use, Prince Ahmed told him that its size would always be proportionate to his army. To outward appearance, the Sultan expressed great obligation to the prince his son for so noble a present, desiring him to return his thanks to the fairy Pari Banu, and to show what a value he set on it, he ordered it to be carefully laid up in his treasury. But within himself he became more jealous than ever, considering that by the fairy's assistance the prince his son might perform things that were infinitely above his own power, notwithstanding his greatness and riches. And therefore, more intent upon his ruin, he went to consult the magician again, who advised him to request the prince to bring him some of the water from the Fountain of Lions. In the evening, when the Sultan was surrounded as usual by all his court, and the prince came to pay his respects among the rest, he said to him, "Son, I have already expressed how much I am obliged to you for the present of the tent you have procured me, which I look upon as the most valuable thing in my treasury. But you must do one more thing for me. I am informed that the fairy your wife makes use of a certain water, called the water of the Fountain of Lions, which cures all sorts of fevers, even the most dangerous. And as I am perfectly sure that my health is dear to you, I do not doubt that you will ask her for a bottle of that water for me, and bring it me as a sovereign remedy, which I may make use of when I have occasion. Do me this service, and complete the duty of a good son toward a tender father." Prince Ahmed, who had believed that the Sultan his father would have been satisfied with so singular and useful a tent as that which he had brought, and that he would not have imposed any new task upon him which might hazard the fairy's displeasure, was thunderstruck at this new request, notwithstanding the assurance she had given him of granting him whatever lay in her power. After a long silence, he said, "I beg of your majesty to be assured that there is nothing I would not undertake to prolong your life. But I wish it might not be by means of my wife. For this reason I dare not promise to bring the water. All I can do is to assure you I will ask her. But it will be with as great reluctance as when I asked for the tent." The next morning, Prince Ahmed returned to the fairy Pari Banu and related to her sincerely and faithfully all that had passed at the Sultan his father's court. From the giving of the tent, which he told her he received with the utmost gratitude, to the new request he had charged him to make, and when he had done, he added, "But, my princess, I only tell you this as a plain account of what passed between me and my father. I leave you to your own discretion to gratify or reject this new desire. It shall be as you please." "No, no," replied the fairy Pari Banu. "Whatever advice the magician can give him, for I see that he hearkens to her, he shall find no fault with you or me. There is a great deal of wickedness in this demand, as you will understand by what I am going to tell you. The Fountain of Lions is situated in the middle of a court of a great castle, the entrance into which is guarded by 4 fierce lions, 2 of which sleep, while the other 2 are awake alternately. But not let that frighten you. I will give you means to pass by them without any danger." The fairy Pari Banu was at that time hard at work with her needle, and as she had by her several balls of thread, she took up one, and presenting it to Prince Ahmed, said, "First, take this ball of thread. I will tell you presently the use of it. In the second place, you must have 2 horses. One you will ride yourself, and the other you will lead, which must be loaded with a sheep, cut into 4 quarters, and killed today. In the third place, you must be provided with a bottle which I will give you to bring the water in. Set out early tomorrow morning, and when you have passed the iron gate, throw before you the ball of thread, which will roll till it comes to the gates of the castle. When it stops, as the gates will be open, you will see the 4 lions. The 2 that are awake will, by their roaring, wake the other 2. Be not frightened, but throw each of them a quarter of the sheep, and then clap spurs to your horse and ride to the fountain. Fill your bottle without alighting, and then return with the same speed. The lions will be so busy eating that they will let you pass." Prince Ahmed set out the next morning at the time appointed by the fairy and followed her directions carefully. When he arrived at the gates of the castle, he distributed the quarters of the sheep among the 4 lions, and passing through the midst of them with haste, got to the fountain, filled his bottle, and returned as safe and sound as he went. When he was a little distance from the castle gates, he turned round, and perceiving 2 of the lions coming after him, he drew his saber and prepared for defense. But as he went forward, he saw one of them turned off the road, and showed by his head and tail that he did not come to do him any harm, but only to go before him, and that the other stayed behind to follow. He therefore put his sword again into its scabbard. Guarded in this manner, he arrived at the capital of the Indies, but the lions never left him till they had conducted him to the gates of the Sultan's palace, after which they returned the way they came, though not without frightening all that saw them, who fled or hid themselves, though they walked gently and showed no signs of fierceness. A great many officers came to attend the prince while he dismounted and conducted him to the apartments of the Sultan, who was at that time conversing with his favorites. He approached the throne, laid the bottle at the Sultan's feet, kissed the rich carpet which covered the footstool, and rising said, "I have brought you, sir, the health-giving water which your majesty so much desired to keep in your treasury, but at the same time wish you such health that you may never have occasion to make use of it." After the prince had finished speaking, the Sultan placed him on his right hand, and then said, "Son, I am very much obliged to you for this valuable present, also for the great danger which you have exposed yourself to upon my account, which I have been informed of by the magician who knows the Fountain of Lions. But do me the pleasure," he continued, "to tell me by what incredible power you have been preserved." "Sir," replied Prince Ahmed, "I have no share in the compliment your majesty is pleased to make me. All the honor is due to the fairy, my wife. I merely followed her good advice." The Sultan showed outwardly all the demonstrations of joy, but secretly became more and more jealous, retired into an inner apartment, and sent for the magician. After conferring with her, the Sultan next day said to the prince in the midst of all his courtiers, "Son, I have one more thing to ask of you, after which I shall expect nothing more from your obedience nor your influence with your wife. This request is, to bring me a man not above 1.5 feet high, whose beard is 30 feet long, who carries upon his shoulders a bar of iron of 500 weight, which he uses as a quarterstaff, and who can speak." Prince Ahmed, who did not believe that there was such a man in the world as his father described, would gladly have excused himself, but the Sultan persisted in his demand and told him that the fairy could do more incredible things. Next day the prince returned to the subterranean kingdom of Fairy Pari Banu, to whom he told his father's new demand, which, he said, he looked upon as more impossible than the first 2. "For," added he, "I cannot imagine that there is or can be such a man in the world. Either he has a mind to try whether I am silly enough to go and seek him, or if there is such a man, he seeks my ruin. How can he suppose that I should get a hold of a man so small, armed as he describes? What arms could I make use of to reduce him to submission?" "Do not affright yourself, Prince," replied the fairy. "You ran a risk in fetching the water of the Fountain of Lions for your father, but there is no danger in finding this man. It is my brother, Shaibar, who is so far from being like me, though we both have the same father, that he is of so violent a nature that nothing can prevent him giving gory marks of his resentment for a slight offense. Yet, on the other hand, he is so good as to oblige anyone in whatever they desire. He is made exactly as the Sultan your father has described him, and he has no other arms than a bar of iron 500 pounds in weight, without which he never stirs, and which makes him respected. I will send for him, and you shall judge of the truth of what I tell you, and prepare not to be frightened when you see him." "What, my queen?" replied Prince Ahmed. "Do you say Shaibar is your brother? Let him be ever so ugly or deformed, I shall love and honor him, and consider him as my nearest relation." The fairy ordered a gold chafing dish to be set with a fire in it under the porch of her palace, with a box of the same metal. Taking some incense out of this and throwing it into the fire, there arose a thick cloud of smoke. Some moments after, the fairy said to Prince Ahmed, "Prince, here comes my brother. Do you see him?" The prince immediately perceived Shaibar, who was but 1.5 feet high, coming gravely with his heavy bar on his shoulder. His beard, 30 feet long, supported itself before him, and a pair of thick mustaches were tucked up to his ears, almost covering his face. His eyes were very small, like a pig's, and sunk deep in his head, which was of an enormous size, and on which he wore a pointed cap. Besides all this, he had a hump behind and before. If Prince Ahmed had not known that Shaibar was Pari Banu's brother, he would not have been able to look at him without fear. But knowing beforehand who he was, he waited for him with the fairy, and received him without the least concern. Shaibar, as he came forward, looked at the prince with an eye that might have chilled his soul and his body, and asked Pari Banu who that man was. To which she replied, "He is my husband, brother. His name is Ahmed. He is son to the Sultan of the Indies. The reason why I did not invite you to my wedding was that I was unwilling to divert you from the expedition you were engaged in, and from which I heard with pleasure that you returned victorious. On his account I have taken the liberty now to send for you." At these words, Shaibar looked at Prince Ahmed with a favorable eye, which, however, diminished neither his fierceness nor his savage look, said, "Is there anything, sister, in which I can serve him? He has only to speak. It is enough for me that he is your husband." "The Sultan, his father," replied Pari Banu, "has a curiosity to see you, and I desire he may be your guide to the Sultan's court." "He need but lead the way, I will follow him," replied Shaibar. "Brother," replied Pari Banu, "it is too late to go today. Therefore stay till tomorrow morning, and in the meantime, as it is desirable that you should know all that has passed between the Sultan of the Indies and Prince Ahmed since our marriage, I will tell you this evening." Next morning, after Shaibar had been informed of all that was proper for him to know, he set out with Prince Ahmed, who was to present him to the Sultan. When they arrived at the gates of the capital, the people no sooner saw Shaibar than they ran and hid themselves in their shops and houses and shut their doors, while others took to their heels and communicated their fear to all they met, who did not wait to look behind them, but ran too. Insomuch that Shaibar and Prince Ahmed, as they went along, found all the streets and squares deserted, till they came to the palace, where the porters, instead of preventing Shaibar from entering, also ran away. So that the prince and he advanced without any obstacle to the council hall, where the Sultan was seated on his throne giving audience. Here, likewise, the officers at the approach of Shaibar abandoned their posts. Shaibar, carrying his head erect, went fiercely up to the throne, without waiting to be introduced by Prince Ahmed, and accosted the Sultan of the Indies in these words: "You have asked for me. See, here I am. What do you want with me?" The Sultan, instead of answering, clapped his hands before his eyes and turned away his head, to avoid the sight of so terrible an object. Shaibar was so much provoked at this uncivil and rude reception, after the Sultan had given him the trouble to come so far, that he instantly lifted up his iron bar, and saying, "Speak then," let it fall on his head, and killed him before Prince Ahmed could intercede in his behalf. All that he could do was to prevent his killing the Grand Vizier, who sat not far from him on his right hand, representing to him that he had always given the Sultan his father good advice. "These are they, then," said Shaibar, "who gave him bad advice." And as he pronounced these words, he killed all the other viziers on the right and left, flatterers and favorites of the Sultan, who were Prince Ahmed's enemies. Every time he struck, he killed someone or other, and none escaped but they who, not rendered motionless by fear, saved themselves by flight. When this terrible execution was over, Shaibar came out of the council hall into the midst of the courtyard with the iron bar on his shoulder, and looking at the Grand Vizier who owed his life to Prince Ahmed, he said, "I know there is a certain sorceress who is a greater enemy of the prince my brother-in-law than all those base favorites I have chastised. Let her be brought to me at once." The Grand Vizier immediately sent for her, and as soon as she was brought, Shaibar said, knocking her down with his iron bar, "Take the reward of thy pernicious counsel, and learn to feign illness again," and left her dead on the spot. After this he said, "This is not enough. I will treat the whole city in the same manner if they do not immediately acknowledge Prince Ahmed, my brother-in-law, for their Sultan, and Sultan of the Indies." Then all that were present made the air ring with the repeated acclamations of "Long life to Sultan Ahmed!" and immediately afterwards he was proclaimed throughout the whole town. Shaibar made him be clothed in the royal vestments, installed him on the throne, and after he had made all due homage and fidelity to him, went and fetched his sister Pari Banu, whom he brought with great pomp, and made her acknowledged Sultaness of the Indies. As for Prince Ali and Princess Nuranahar, as they had no hand in the conspiracy against Prince Ahmed, nor knew of any such conspiracy, Prince Ahmed assigned them a considerable province with its capital, where they spent the rest of their lives. Afterwards he sent an officer to Prince Hussein to acquaint him with the change, and to make him an offer of whichever province he liked best. But the prince thought himself so happy in his solitude that he bade the officer return the Sultan his brother thanks for his kindness, assuring him of his submission and saying that the only favor he desired was leave to live retired in the place he had made his choice of for his retreat. And that is the rather surprising end to Prince Ahmed and the Fairy. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you again next week for our next story from the Arabian Nights, which is The King of Persia and the Princess of the Sea. Bedtime Stories with Celosia Crane is proudly produced by Lantern Audio Works. Check out our other podcast, Punks in the Library, where we are broadcasting live episodes through the Bullhorn podcasting app every Saturday for the month of August, live from the library. You can find the Bullhorn app in your app store. It is entirely free and is an amazing tool that you can interact with us live. We look forward to seeing you at our next live recording.